Hi, BC family. Welcome to your midweek devotion. The last couple of weeks, I've talked about Psalms 23, Habakkuk, and one of the running themes throughout that is that God can take anything and turn it around. And today, I want to talk to you about a moment with Mary Magdalene where we see how much God can turn around a situation. So I want to start off in John 20, verse 1. We see Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb of Jesus early in the morning. It says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been removed." So I want to point out a few things about this verse. It says that she went out while it was still dark. So I can probably take a guess and say that she isn't sleeping very well. She's probably stressed out, anxiety-ridden, grief-stricken. I like how Priscilla Schreier wrote about this moment. She really put it into a perspective. She said, hopes were dashed. The life that she knew was over. Jesus had just died, and the shock and horror of it were still seeping into all of their lives, right? He had just been crucified. Not only was it dark outside, but one can assume this was one of her darkest moments. Everything she believed in, thought would happen, loved, was seemingly taken in a brutal fashion right before her. I really like that visual. How many of us has had that moment before or are currently in a moment like that? Where a phone call, a pandemic, a moment can suddenly change our world, right? It can change our plans. Grief can come in, and sadness and anger and strife just in a moment's notice, right? And it can feel much like a dark season. And a lot like Habakkuk, it probably felt like when it rains, it pours. Right? Remember how we talked about that with Habakkuk, because not only did she just endure the crucifixion, but now in her distress, she wanted a little comfort. She wanted comfort by going to Jesus, seeking out his tomb. And she comes here to find out he's gone, right? And in her mind, he was probably taken by horrible people doing horrible things to him. So it just, her problems seem to be mounting, right? And when we're going through hard times and dark seasons and storms, that can sometimes rock us to our core, right? And we seek God sometimes, and sometimes we don't hear from him right away, or we don't see him right away in our situations. And in that moment, the voices of our problems become louder to us. And we can't see God. We can't hear Jesus. So Mary went to the tomb to get peace, to bring some sort of closure into her life. But she didn't find it. But much like the valley of the shadow of death, the reality was Jesus was there. He was still there. She just couldn't see him in that moment, right? Because God says, I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. He's always there, even if we're not seeing him. And if you read the next few verses, Mary had ran to go get the other disciples to show them what had happened. And they came and they saw and they left, but Mary stayed. And I like this moment because if you pair it with our lives of what I was just talking about earlier, she sought out Jesus, the comforter. She wanted that comfort. She wanted to see Jesus. She couldn't find him. But instead of walking away, of giving up and saying, well, I guess God doesn't care about my problems, or God must want me to suffer, or I guess it's not for me, right? Instead of thinking all those things and doing all those things, we should be like Mary and stay put. Stay in him. Mary stayed, and we need to stay in him. Even if it feels like all of those things, we need to stay grounded in his word, because we need to remember who God really is and say, no, God would never want me to suffer. He cares for me. He sent his only son to die on the cross because he loves me, right? That's when you silence those thoughts and stay and be louder than the voices of our problems. That's when you let the promises of God be louder than your problems. And that is staying in him. So now we're into verses 11. So I'm going to read verses 11 through 18. So if you just bear with me for a moment. So 20 verse 11 through 18, it says, "But Mary remained standing outside the tomb, sobbing, and she wept and stooped down into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. And they said to her, 'Woman, why are you sobbing?' And she told them, 'Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' And on saying this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you crying? For whom are you looking?' Supposing that it was the gardener, she replied, 'Sir, if you carried him away from here, tell me where you have put him, and I will take him away.' And Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' And turning around, she said to him in Hebrew, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher or master. And Jesus said to her, 'Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brethren and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God.' And away came Mary Magdalene, bringing the disciples news that she had seen the Lord and that he had said these things to her." So a few things I want to point out. First is in verse 12, Mary had had an encounter with God. She saw two angels in white sitting there and she spoke to them, but that encounter didn't bring her comfort in that moment, didn't bring her peace. They didn't seem to give her an answer. So she turned around seeking another answer. In the middle of what seems like our storms or our seasons or our problems, we can have an encounter with God. We can have a glimpse of our breakthrough. But if we turn away from it and let the problem be louder than the promises, then we miss what God has for us. She turned away from the angels. She didn't really give them any time to say anything. She turned away from the angels, and in verse 14, looked directly at Jesus. She was seeking him, and now she's looking directly at him, but didn't recognize him. We can be in the middle of seeking God, desperate, but if those voices are louder than the promises, if our vision is clouded by the shadow, we miss the light that is there, right? She was seeking Jesus, and he was right there. But I feel like if you can take this scene and really picture it, she's frantic, right? She woke up, she couldn't sleep. She woke up with grief and worry and anxiety, and it was consumed with dark. And she came to seek peace and got hit by another blow. Jesus was gone. And her mind is running wild with all the things that could have happened to him. She goes and gets her friends, she shows them, they leave her there, and she's choosing to stay, trying desperately to find an answer, right? And she runs into the tomb, and there she sees angels, but she's desperate to heal this hurt and despair. And she sees the angels sitting there, which, by the way, if you were just in that tomb and there was no angels, and then you go back in and there's angels, that's like a wow moment. So you can really see how frantic and just whirlwind with her problems she is if she runs back in there, sees the angels, and then turns around to run back out, right? She's being consumed by the weight of life. She's just running and spewing questions, not getting an answer quick enough. She runs around, turns around, and through the tears and puffy face, she sees a man whom she assumes is a gardener and is pleading with him to bring back what she needs. The desperation and despair that she had to have been so real and so heavy for her. And it's in these moments that if we don't silence the cries of the world and our problems, we will miss the peace and the love and the answers that are standing in front of us. Jesus was right there. Everything she needed was there, but she was allowing all the weight of the problem to blind her from what was truly there for her. And Habakkuk talked about this, being still, taking that breath and being still in his presence, expectantly waiting for an answer, not frantically running around for one, right? One thing to note, though, and I said it before, is Mary did stay. And in a state of her darkest moments, she stayed in God's presence and she was seeking Jesus. She didn't give up and just leave. She didn't turn to her friends or the news. She stayed seeking Jesus. And suddenly we see that Jesus called her by name. Mary had a relationship with Jesus. Jesus died so that we could have an intimate relationship with him. He died so that he could be our Savior, our best friend, so God could be our Father, whom we go to, always knowing he's there to help us, right? He's a good, good Father. And in Isaiah 43:1, it says, I have called you by your name. You are mine. And the very next verse demonstrates how much he loves us. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned or scorched, nor will the flame kindle upon you. And in verse 4, it continues, because you are precious in my sight and honored, and because I love you, I will give men in return for you and people in exchange for your life. Why would he do all that? He just told us in verse 1, because he has called us by name, and you are mine, we are his, and he would do anything for us. Now, in this first moment, her problems were louder than his voice, right? She didn't recognize him. But she stayed seeking. We don't always get it right the first time. But when we stay in him, he is always there calling us. And it is important to know his voice. Imagine if Jesus said Mary and she just disregarded and left. That would have been a bummer. But no, it says in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary, with an exclamation point. He said it loud, bold, with authority. He wanted her to be still, to take a moment. And it says she turned around. She had enough of a relationship with him to know his voice. He said, Mary, and she turned around and said, Rabboni. You know, in that moment that she turned to God, she had peace. She stopped listening to the problems and being consumed by the dark. She was frantically running around, but in that moment, she stopped. That's that breath. She stopped and turned to Jesus. I again love how Priscilla Schreier paints this moment. She said she turned, and when she did, everything changed. In changing her perspective and reorienting her focus, everything became revolutionized. Her morning, her outlook, her future, her whole life Despair dissolved into hopeful joy because she turned from an empty tomb of disappointment to the full embodiment of the risen Savior. When we turn and fix our eyes on him, then the weight of everything that we have been holding on to dissipates and disappears, and a peace which transcends all understanding can mount upon our hearts and our minds. Only he can give that kind of peace, that peace which no one else can describe, that peace which cloaks us. And when we can go from sobbing into our pillows, riddled with grief and fear and anxiety and anger, and turn it into that joy, right? That's how you can take a problem and allow joy to become our strength, to get us up and off our feet. So the last thing that I wanted to say and point out is in verse 18, it says, "Away came Mary Magdalene, bringing the disciples news that she had seen the Lord and that he had said these things to her." You see, earlier she went and got her friends and brought them into her problem, which we do that as well, right? We seek our friends and ask for prayer, ask for insight, ask for help, which isn't a bad thing. But they were not able to help her and left. And she stayed and continued to seek Jesus and received her answers, her promises, and her victory. And then, here's the key, she went back and got those same friends. She brought those same friends into her victory. She remembered to share what Jesus had said and done for her with others. We need to remember that while it's okay to bring some people into our problems, we need to also bring them into our victories, to shed the light in the dark. So this week, take what we learned from Mary Magdalene. In our darkest moments, go to Jesus. Even if we don't see him at first, stay in him. Continue to seek him. Be still in him to hear his voice when he calls to you. Turn to him. And then tell others of what he has done for you. Be the bearer of hope this week. Have a great week.